All right, so this is going to be part one of our lecture covering chapter two, which is personality and sport. So what we're going to be going over in this lecture is we're going to be talking about, what really is personality, what makes it up, what are the different approaches to understanding personality, and then lastly, what are some do's and don'ts in personality testing. So personality, its structure. Let's talk about that first off. Well, personality is really the characteristics or blend of characteristics that make a person unique. This is literally the stuff that makes us who we are. Now, generally speaking, the structure of personality has three components. Okay, there's the psychological core, the typical responses, and then role-related behavior. Now, if you go in your textbook, there's in the chapter, figure 2.1 kind of gives you a nice depiction of this. Now, what's nice about this is it basically shows that the psychological core is our base. This is our internal foundation. Okay, so that's why it's down here. It's internal, it's constant. This is something that really doesn't fluctuate. Now, in the social environment, so again, the environment that we're situated in, may impose some stress or trying to cause some change, but ultimately the psychological core will not change very readily. The next part is the typical responses. So again, we'll talk about this in a moment, but this is how we respond to some things in our environment. So you can see this will be based on our psychological core. This is usually a great marker of what's going on in our core. And then lastly, there's the role-related behavior, and this is where things are happening in the environment and how we're responding to them. So let's talk about this. The most basic and deepest attitudes, values, interests, motives, self-worth of a person. Now this real, quote unquote, real person, this is our psychological core. So we might think of something like a person's religious views, okay? Or maybe someone holds honesty as a core value. If that's the case, we're going to see that core value really permeate through how the person interacts with their environment. Now, typical responses, again, this is the way one typically adjusts and responds to the environment. So you can think of someone being fairly happy-go-lucky, shy, or introverted, that kind of thing. Okay. And then lastly, there's the role-related behavior. So this is how someone might act in a particular social situation. So we might think of how someone might act on a date, act in a class, maybe act at a party, who knows, whatever it might be. But that's generally going to be informed by our typical responses, which again is grounded in our psychological core. Now, there are some different approaches to understanding personality. There's the phenomenological approach, interactional, trait, psychodynamic, and situational. We're going to talk about each one just a little bit, okay? So if we have this continuum here, and we're talking about the most internal to the most external view, the starting point is going to be the psychodynamic perspective, which was really put out there and established by Sigmund Freud. Some of you might be familiar with that name, but really he talks about how our personality is the result of this internal struggle or interaction between the id, ego, and superego. Okay, and these are things like our instincts, our rational behavior, our morals, and those are generally shaped by things that happen at a very young age. Okay, but it basically takes the stance that our personality is completely based on an internal process. It has nothing to do with the environment that a person's situated in. The next one would be trait. Okay, so trait is a bit different. It basically says that we have personality traits. If I am a competitive person, then I will be competitive across all environments. Okay, now that could mean that I am competitive in sports, so I am competitive in all sports. Maybe I am an extrovert, so I am an extrovert in all social situations. The next one is really one that a lot of sports psych consultants or just sports psych professionals tend to adopt is this interactional approach. So that's looking at the role of traits, but then also how the social environment may draw out or determine some outward behavior or personality being displayed. Then there's the phenomenological. Now this one is very philosophical. So this one really looks at how an individual interprets themselves being in a environment. So how aware they are of an environment. If you're interested in this, there's a lot of great work on excuse me, I can't even say it, phenomenology. But it is heavy on the philosophical side in that it just basically says it really is hell-bent on understanding how the individual perceives themselves and how they perceive the environment that they're situated in. And then the last one is situational. Okay, so this one basically says that from situation to situation, from sport to sport, from game to game, our personality is going to be dictated by the environment or the social cues, the things that are going on around us. So let's step back now. Let's talk about each one of these real quick. So the psychodynamic approach, the current impact, it really doesn't have much influence. We generally don't use it in sports psych uh, because it really focuses entirely on the internal determinants of behavior. You know, it really is not interested in what's going on or where the person is situated. But there have been some contribution, and it basically really has made us aware that there might be some unconscious processes, some things going on in a person's mind that are dictating or at least influencing how an individual is going to engage or enact behaviors in some social environment. The trait approach, again, it's had little influence. Generally, we don't use this in sports psych. We don't think people are so robotic or set in their ways that there isn't some fluctuation across situations. But still, the contribution is that it emphasizes the importance of traits and the measurement of such traits, which could persist to some degree across situations. Then we have the situational approach. I know it's a little bit out of order, but when we're talking about trait, it's almost natural to talk about situational next. Again, this one, it's at that other extreme of our continuum. It says basically that, hey, it's all about the situation that the person is in or the environment that they're in. So it tends to really push this idea of, you know, it's all about what's going on around a person, which we know might not be the whole story. Then there's the interactional approach. Now, this is one that we really kind of hang our hat on in sports psych because we really do believe generally it says there are no weaknesses, but there could be. Someone could make a stretch and explain one, but it basically says that really we have some trait, we have there is some baseline of how we might interact in an environment, but that environment's going to also elicit some responses from us. So it's very interactional, it's very reciprocal in how this process would continue. Again, the phenomenological tends to be a bit philosophical, but it actually has a lot of influence in sports psych. A lot of people do use this. I've used this myself in the past. Excuse me, but it really emphasized the contributions of a person's interpretations of themselves and the environment, right? While it's important that we may have some objective understanding of what sport is, what competitiveness is, whatever it might be, but it's going to all really ultimately boil down to, well, how does the athlete interpret this situation, right? Just because we intend for it to be interpreted one way doesn't mean it will be. So how do we go about measuring some of this stuff, especially the traits and states that are connected with personality? Well, there's a lot of benefit to measuring both, right? Because we want to know how a person will generally react to situations. So that's going to be the trait, and then the state side is going to be how they might engage in behaviors that are different from situation to situation, which is what they have, which I've outlined here. Now that's the end of part one. We're going to talk about actually measuring personality next, but I just want to give you guys a quick snapshot. We've talked about trait, we've talked about state stuff before. So again, we're going to look at this and we're going to talk about how do we go about measuring personality. We can't throw it on a scale. We can't hold it. So how are we gonna grasp this intangible thing? Okay. So when you get a moment, go ahead, move on to part two of our lecture on personality.